Good to see everyone today in this virtual conference. So I'll get started here, and I'm going to do just a quick little bit of additional background, not only myself but also on the other panelists. So Jason Bolton, as everyone heard, food safety specialist. I also run an innovation program out of the Maine Business School, and newly a program administrator with Cooperative Extension in food, nutrition, aquaculture, and innovation. But I work with a lot of food businesses, like many of you, and educate around general food safety, but I do teach preventive controls. And it's interesting, I think, as an educator with this panel to see what's actually happening in the field when it comes to the actual inspections. So we teach them, the processors and so forth, how to get ready for them and how to put together their food safety plans, but these inspectors are going to share a little bit about what they see actually out in the field and what those investigations or those inspections look like when it comes to PC. Or in the case of John Morris, he's going to talk a little bit more about updated current good manufacturing practices and what he's seeing out there for things that are going well and things that are not going so well. John, why don't we get started with you in the sense of if you want to provide any additional background on yourself or what you do, and then Monica will go right after John.
Good morning. I'm a consumer protection inspector with the Maine Department of Agriculture. I spend the bulk of my time, I've been doing this for 13 years now, bulk of my time is with retail stores, but we also do license and inspect all food processors. We do FDA contracts, get assignments, which I'm working on right now, somewhere between 10 and a dozen contracts a year. Our contracts are limited scope PC inspections, and our contract hasn't changed. We haven't left the limited scope PC inspections. I guess at this point, partially because of COVID, we haven't been able to get the training on site with FDA that is required. We haven't had our audits in the last year or two that are required. So that's where we stand. So my territory in the state is essentially on the coast, the upper third of the coast, and most of my work is done with HACCP inspections, seafood HACCP. I do a very little bit of GMP inspections pretty much once a year, and the rest of my work is with seafood.
Thank you, John. Monica, do you want to tell the folks a little bit about yourself and what you do for Connecticut?
Hi, my name is Monica Robertson. I work as a food inspector for consumer protection for the state of Connecticut. I've been doing this job for 9 years, and I started the PC inspections in 2019. I did so far 11 PC inspection, and we have a few large companies in Connecticut that are producing food and are subject to the PC inspections. Most of them, so there were a few ice cream mix manufacturers, one that does also cheese, so that was under the milk ordinance. Then we have a couple of bakeries that produce regular bread or gluten-free bread. And I also did the one manufacturer that does the frozen prepared meals like pasta meals, mostly vegetarian. They're not under USDA. So I've been doing about, so the first year I did just a couple of inspections, but then last year I did about 6 or 7. I did a couple this year, and I actually have 2 more to go, one next week and one next month.
Thanks, Monica. So we'll get started with a few questions, and I'll tell the audience here, if you have any burning questions, just raise your hand on Zoom here, or you can type it into the chat. But we'll also have a time at the very end for additional questions and answers. So no worries. But don't be afraid to ask questions as we're going along here. All right. So first question for the panelists here. In general, how are things going with the PC inspections and updated current good manufacturing practices, especially when it comes to things related to updates for good manufacturing practices related to training, worker training, and also cross-contact updates and some of that language that has changed. So why don't we get started with Monica? Why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the PC inspections? You discussed some of the companies you've worked with, but how are the inspections in general going? And then I'll have some follow-up questions for you.
Yeah, so when we go there, obviously, you present your credentials and talk to, so first of all these PC inspections we do are under the FDA contract. They count as the state inspections as well. And actually, I was talking to my boss because we have a couple of marijuana plants that they do baked goods using the oil, and then they're not federally inspected, so we were talking about maybe doing a PC inspection for those places too, but it's just a proposal. But with the regular FDA inspections, I usually when I go there, being so large, these firms are mostly in production all the time. So I have the chance to observe production. That's what I want to do first. And then I just tell them exactly what documents I need to review. And usually this firms being so large and, they have the manpower to have all the documents in order and to have their records properly done. It's more of a challenge for smaller companies that are between $1 and $10 million. Some of them, are like moms and pops. I personally never encountered a firm that did not have the food safety plan when they were required to, but I know a couple of my colleagues that had that issue with particularly one little bakery that didn't even know they needed anything. They weren't keeping any kind of records for anything. So one of the biggest challenges I have for firms that already have a food safety plan, and this is across the board also, like for seafood or any type of, HACCP blend juice acidified, if they don't keep proper records. I spent so usually an inspection takes around 3 days for me. I spend so many hours just trying to figure out what's missing and what is placed where, because this firm had a food safety plan, was incomplete, records were missing, they didn't know what to do with certain records that they received, like a COA for the flour. So those are the most time consuming. And the sanitation that we have to observe at night, that is also like when you do this type of inspections, you have to think about flexibility because you need to observe sanitation, and it's up to kind of your discretion if you want to see the full sanitation being done. Some firms just do it over the weekend, some overnight, but there are also the pre-op procedures when they just walk around the plant and they start, they do the ATP swabbing, and that's accepted as sanitation. Because in case the equipment is not properly cleaned, they usually have the sanitation supervisor and he or she, start cleaning those pieces of equipment. So, but this is still very early in the morning. Sometimes I had to go at 4 in the morning or at 2 a.m., whatever. And so this would be another challenge sometimes, especially, if you have to basically just schedule your inspection so that it fits your personal schedule and the firm's production and sanitation. Usually the firms are welcome. I wouldn't say welcoming us, but they're not, aggressive or annoyed, or I did not have that attitude when I did a PC inspection. I did encounter that a couple of times for the regular GMP ones, but not in this situation.
Yeah, thank you, Monica. We had a couple of quick follow-up questions, then I'll get to John. So one of the questions here, you have a different approach in assessing PCs versus PRPs with very small versus larger processors. So do you have a different approach when you go in and do that, not only difference on size, but also PCs versus PRPs, which Dave, do you mind defining that just to make sure everyone's, because I'm not sure I actually know what you're referring to there. PRPs?
Yeah, hi, how you doing? This is Dave Seddon. The question was in regards to controls that you're looking at in regarding to preventive controls, plus any prerequisite programs that you might be finding associated with those PCs, and if you think that there's any ways of approaching those very small, under $1 million versus those that are the higher ranges, as you just pointed out to.
And I think that's not only a question for Monica, but also, John, I know you're working with a lot of the smaller processors where you're looking at just GMP prerequisite programs. So Monica, do you have a different approach between the prerequisite programs and the PCs for small versus larger processors when you're going into do an inspection? And then John, the same question for you.
I usually do large firms, so they mostly have a PC, they do the PC versus the PRP. Some of them incorporated the PRPs into their food safety plan. And I always want to see those records, and I always mention that in my report. But from what I've seen so far, FDA accepts it as long as something is there and they actually are controlling and they know what they're doing.
Thank you. And John, I don't know, first question originally was around how's the rollout of some of the, in your case, the current good manufacturing practices and then the updates related to worker training and cross-contact updates. And then the follow-up to that is around your approach for, in this case, it'd be more prerequisite programs, small versus large processors.
Yeah, I'm running into the same issue where training is an issue, and that can be reflected in the size of the business. The smaller they are, the less time they seem to spend with training. The larger they are, they can delegate training to a professional within the company. And record keeping also of the training. A large salmon processor with 80 people on the floor didn't have the records, didn't have the training that their employees needed. And when that was pointed out to them, they immediately held a meeting, brought in pizza for everyone, did their training, got all the signed documents, and it was done immediately and worked out very well. Small operation doesn't go that smoothly necessarily, and they don't always have the record. And quite often they're just not aware. More times than not, I'm introducing this to them. They do not seem to be aware of the fact that they do need the training and they do need the records. I'm sorry, the other was what, with regard to cross-contact?
Yeah, just any updates with current good manufacturing practices that is kind of associated with the PC rule there and the updates associated with that. So anything that you've noticed firms have adapted to that or changed that, or maybe they're just not even aware of it. So there wasn't a question around how aware are they of some of the updates related to PC and the GMPs?
The question of it is they're not aware. And there again, that goes with the size of the business. frequency of inspections, communication. They're not awake. They're not aware all the time of what has changed until it's brought to their attention. So the inspections are the time when they're introduced to this, and as far as specifics, nothing specific. I mean, it's across the board, and there again, it all depends on the facility and what they're doing. A lot of my limited scope PC inspections are with companies that are producing a single ingredient product, and it's fairly straightforward. Prerequisites, if it's an organic product that they're doing, they certainly have done their homework on the ingredient coming in, and so they've done their prerequisite work there. But as I said, most of them, and I'm looking at everything from coffee roasters, sea salt, seaweed, blueberries, bottled water. They're all, single ingredient products that I'm dealing with for the most part. Cross contact is an issue in certain ones. Awareness of allergens seems to be okay. I'm still finding some that are not aware, labeling issues. But there again, it all depends on the size of the business. And as far as record keeping, the smaller business, you do an inspection, you're dealing with one person throughout the inspection. A larger company, you have a better chance to observe the whole operation because you've got management in various departments. You can spend time, and quite often it's hard to get that time when it is a small operation because they're operating, they're processing at the time you're there.
Okay, thank you. So,
if I can just add
Oh,
something,
sure.
Jason, I'm sorry. So regarding the, firms to be aware that there's a guidance online available for them. I did encounter one of the firms here, which I used to inspect under regular GMP, and they're very good. And they were not aware of the guide. They did have the food safety plan, and all the records were perfect. So but they were not aware of this guide. So when I told them, and then I went next day to continue my inspection, they already printed that out and they already studied it. They already called their QA and the food safety manager, and everybody was, up to speed in less than, 12 hours. Also, in some of the inspections, I noticed there's a language barrier, especially if the workers don't speak English or, they work through a translator. I had a firm that hired a consultant's firm, and they developed all their food safety plan. This is the one that really gave me the hardest time. And they actually sent out a checklist of sanitation, and they didn't even have the machines that were on that checklist. So the consultant, what he did, he just gave them a list that he made for another company, and just gave it to these people. The sanitation manager did not speak proper English, so he was just checking off those, on the list without even knowing what he does. And if, let's say, a machine was like they had the dough mixer, let's say, and it was there, a dough mixer, he would just check it off. I said, but that's not clean. How can you just, check off? Oh, but I looked at it. I said, yeah, but that's not about just looking at it. If it's not clean, you have to clean it. That's why you have this checklist. So this is another thing, and I always tell this to the managers and the owners. If you hire somebody to do your food safety plan, make sure you're behind them and you go with them and see what they're doing. because they can just give you a check-off list of sanitation and you don't even have those machines, and then you clean other machines that are not on the list. So that's another thing that I encountered.
Oh, that's great. I mean, the concept of having a list that's accurate and then it's accurately filled out when it comes to a record, I think is really important. So what other misunderstandings, hurdles, or let's say even 483 violations have you seen as kind of a trend? And I know that, Monica, you said you've only done around, or not only, but you have executed around 10 or 11 PC inspections with GMPs. And then John, if you want to answer kind of the same question related to GMPs. So what types of, once again, additional misunderstandings, hurdles, or even, let's say, 483 violations have you actually had to write up?
So the, like John said, the training is a big issue, because sometimes the firm's paperwork, like their policy and procedure, is so beautiful and nicely put together, and then the workers don't know, they're not properly trained, they're not educated, they're not shown how to do it. And when you talk to them, it's like you can see that they're lost or they're afraid to answer. They look at their manager, at the line supervisor, whatever. So this is one of the most common ones, when the workers are not actually properly trained. It happens to both very large companies who have a corporate office somewhere else and they just send the procedures out. And especially now that they hired so many new people, or the turnover is so high versus before, that they would have workers that would work there for a long time. And with that in mind, I have other places that they just have one person that's so specialized to do a certain task that nobody else knows how to do it. And if that person is sick or doesn't come to work for a couple of weeks or months, that's not done anymore, or the records are not properly filled up because that person was not present. And to delegate other people to do, and that happened to seafood too, when I did one HACCP plan, and the person that was the seafood a certified person, he was also the driver, so while he was away, he wasn't signing records and things like that. So this is another thing that's very common. But honestly, most of the time, I'm happy with the way they do it. They, as I said, these are large firms that most of them can afford to have, extra manpower just to do that. But many of them complain that, oh my God, it's so much paperwork, and we need to hire a person just to do this or just to do that. And that's a common complaint. But I saw a question here. Somebody was asking me about 483. I have not issued a 483 on PC yet. As I said, I was lucky I didn't have something so bad that I had to do one. I'm not sure how that was done by my colleague that went to this place and they did not have a food safety plan altogether.
Thank you, Monica. John, do you want to kind of comment on that? Aspects of, you've talked a little bit or discussed a little bit about the misunderstandings and hurdles, but any aspects of violations or anything like that you want to add?
I know 483s come to mind with regard to a GMP inspection. Seafood inspections, yes, I can list those all day long. But no, it's there again. It is what Monica said mirrors what I run into. Smaller operation, when one person leaves who's been there for quite some time, they're just left with a void because the training is not set up. They're just counting on someone who has been trained through experience, and when they're gone, the training is gone, and they don't pick up very quickly to fill in that void. That still seems to be the biggest issue. But again, record keeping, as Monica said, it's not unusual to see records filled out right through the end of the week, even though it's Monday, and signed and initialed. I've even seen alternating pens used, but it's all filled out at the same time. So yeah, it's being there and seeing what's going on, and makes you wonder what goes on when you walk out and go home. But
thanks, John. So Monica, could you walk us through first, let's say almost, it doesn't have to be quite hour by hour, but at least the process in which you do an inspection, a PC inspection. So, you mentioned it takes 3 days, but what's the breakdown of that 3 days? You mentioned aspects of sanitation, but how does that work? And then John, kind of the same question for you related to current good manufacturing practices.
Yeah, so as I said, if the firm is in production when I arrive, I ask what's the most hazardous product that they make. Especially if that's the only day that they produce. Let's say I'm there on Monday and their production is Monday, and then they do, other things, and then they start again on Friday. And then the thing is that I always communicate with people. I want to ask them questions. Sometimes it's very difficult because, there's a lot of noise. You have to keep the distance. You have to put a mask on. You can't read lips, if the faces are half covered. So I did have that issue a couple of times, especially lately now with this COVID thing. And then while I walk with them and observe production, I ask a lot of questions. I think sometimes I start annoying them. And then I do the GMP. I walk through, I check for any evidence of pests, for the cleanliness of equipment, for how the workers are handling the products, especially the ready to eat, if they are properly dressed, they have the proper equipment. I mean, like hair nets and beard covers, and they don't have jewelries and fake nails. And then, so then for the records, I ask, when I arrive, I kind of walk through, verify the previous inspection and see if anything has changed as far as the management is concerned. And I have notes already on the previous violations that I want to see if they were corrected from the last inspection. Then the records that I check, I have a full list, and actually, now that you mentioned, maybe I should have just shown that presentation. I can pull it up just to show you what is it, every single item that I check. And they have to have those records ready for me. That's usually the next day. But in the first day, I also ask when is the sanitation conducted, and especially if it's something like a CIP and they have to run it for hours at night, I would make an appointment with the sanitation manager, and I always check with my boss. I have to let her know because I'm using, I have to flex my schedule, plus I'm using the state car off hours. So I have to inform her about that. And then I do the sanitation, and that's usually in the second day, if it's just a normal inspection or it's the night of, or the last night. And then everything else is just record checking, records, and I try not to stress them out too much. And in case I realize that I need additional records from the ones that I initially requested, I try to make a list and give it to them at once, because, I don't want to ask them, oh, I need the calibration records. Okay, they go grab it. And then, oh, you don't have the, I don't know, this records or that record. So I'm trying to, not give them too much hard time. Also, I had a firm that, so my scheduled inspection was Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. but they couldn't do it on Friday because the QA manager had to be somewhere for training. So they asked me if I can do it on Monday, the last day. So between Thursday and Monday, they already corrected all my observations from their food plan, food safety plan. I checked it and I said, well, you're missing this. I don't see that as because the hazard analysis has to be in writing versus the seafood where you don't have to have it in writing, so we don't even check that. So this is a little more in depth. So by the time I came back on Monday, everything related to food safety plan was corrected. So I still mentioned that, those were observations, but I put that they were corrected on site because they did it. So the last day and a half would be just record checking. I've never had a situation that I had to go back the fourth day, but now I'm thinking that one of my inspections will be really 2 hours of driving just to get there and then 2 hours coming back. So that probably would be one of those inspections that I have to go the fourth day. Though they shouldn't have issues, so it should be, faster, not that time consuming, but I don't know. So this is basically the breakdown, and I'm gonna pull that presentation just to show you everything that I check, and I actually have it on the top. This is my inspection notebook, and I have it here, like you can't really see it. It's line by line, just because I don't want to miss anything, because another hurdle is the report writing, which takes a lot of time. It can take a day and a half. And FDA is very particular on checking our reports. And I just don't want to miss anything, because one time, my first inspection ever, I forgot to mention one thing and it was brought up, and, it's a lot of writing. So I also, one of the things is that one of these places didn't really have like production logs. They wouldn't follow, like, you have to follow 2 lot numbers of either the ingredients, usually from the receiving all the way to, being used in the finished product and then shipping. And this firm did not keep records of that. Like, whatever ingredients they used, then, though it was in the recall plan that they would go by the lot number, that was not reflected in the production logs because they had none. So that's another thing that you probably will encounter, especially for the smaller firms. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and kind of a quick follow-up to that before, John, I have you kind of go through your process for GMP inspection. There's a couple questions here. One around, we answered kind of the awareness of the PC rule, but have folks filled out the attestation forms? What is it, form 39 something or other, 3940 something, I can't remember. But anyway, those forms, if they're qualified facility versus a facility that falls under the rule, have you run into that where they haven't filled out the forms to basically, state whether they're qualified or not? And then a quick follow-up to that is, how do you identify the PCQI? Do they come forward as a QC director, or is it, or
so I asked for their training records. They have to have the certification that they are PCQI certified. Some of them really have a lot of experience, and I think, if I remember correctly, it's not very clear in the regulation that they have to have the certification. I think they can be substituted with experience, which again, it's a little vague in the regulation. But I know that the attestation, I've never had a firm that I had to do a PC inspection that would be, subject to like a qualified facility to fill up an attestation. But I did do a couple of GMP inspections that were just on that margin of, being exempt. So I brought up the attestation, and I said, you should fill this up, because otherwise you're going to be inspected under the PC rule, and you're not ready for that. And you're a qualified facility. but I've never had a situation where I had a PC assignment and I went and they were actually subject to the attestation, qualified facility, but they forgot to fill out the attestation. I haven't had that.
Okay, thank you. Now, John, when it comes to GMP inspections, what does that process generally look like for you?
Well, previously, before COVID, we would always go up unannounced and do an inspection. And you absolutely find out what's going on. Now we are calling ahead, letting them know when we're going to be there, which really doesn't make much of a difference. Even though they try to perform differently, when you're there, you get the same results. But they are prepared when you get there. They know you're coming, and sometimes that makes the whole thing easier. So, an introduction is made with the most responsible person and choice of production, what is taking place at the time. And that is what the inspection will observe. If it's a low hazard product, then I might do a paper inspection looking over records of a more hazardous product. And that takes place more with seafood than it would with a GMP, something that is more difficult to produce and much more of a safety concern. Attestation, yeah, I'm finding that people are not aware of that whatsoever. And we don't write them up for that. We do put it in the report, and we inform them on how to do it. I've got small businesses that one woman business, she doesn't even use a computer. So to get them to do the attestation is, you may have to sit down with them and help them through it. They're just not aware. So a lot of it is communication that either they're not getting or they're not responding to. Observation of sanitation, that's always difficult. It depends on, if it's a 10-hour shift, you can obviously observe what's going on during that inspection, but you may or may not be there, and I may or may not return to see the complete sanitation procedure. Sometimes it'll be 2 8-hour shifts and then 1 8-hour shift of strictly sanitation. A qualified individual is hard to find. I'm not finding that there is a qualified individual for training for PC. Just they're not at that level, and they're mostly small businesses. If I'm in a large producer, Wyman Blueberry, someone like that, they've got everything in line. They're prepared. One GMP that I have observed is food that is not for humans, scraps and waste that is put aside for animals, not being labeled as such on the floor. And that's one of the more common ones, I guess, that I come across. So as far as the length of time, it all depends on the facility. And as Monica said, FDA scrutinizes our reports. If we miss something, they'll let us know about it. And we either need to go back and revisit or communicate through email or a phone call and get the answers that are required. So, yeah, it's fairly complete, time consuming.
Thank you, John. And Monica, you said you wanted to share a slide about the documents that you reviewed. So if you want to go ahead and do that screen share, please.
So as you see here, these are the documents that I review. These are not in this particular order. Some of them, would be reviewed anyway because, when you do a regular GMP inspection. So I start with the hazard analysis. I like to conduct my own independent hazard analysis before, I look at the firm's one. I just don't want to be influenced by that. I obviously have to compare that to the firms and then just see the discrepancies, talk about them, and I have to detail that in the report. Their food safety plan labels, which we have to check anyway. The supply chain, as you know, and from the regulation, the subpart G, this is one of the most consuming ones. And I did have a firm that actually, one thing that I forgot to mention about this, and I'm just jumping off a little, is the fact that as detailed as these inspections are, they're a little tunnel vision too, because you basically have to focus on the product that you observe. Obviously, if it's something, really bad with something else that's not pertaining to the product you observe, you can bring it up to the firm and you can discuss it and maybe mention it in the report. But FDA wants you to focus on only one product, because if you focus on everything they have, you're there basically forever. So for the supply chain, I checked this particular product with a lot of ingredients from many suppliers, and actually they were missing one of the suppliers. They didn't have, their the documentation from the supplier. It took them like a week to retrieve all the documents, and but they fixed it. But this is one of the chunkiest part of the inspections, to check the supply chain, especially if it's a product that has a ton of ingredients and a ton of suppliers. Then I check the calibration records, and for the calibration is not only for the thermometer or the pH meter. If they do the pH, then I ask them to show how they calibrate it on site, if they, because they have to do it prior to production. And it's also the metal detector. I want them to show me how they use it and then show calibration records, because that has to be calibrated yearly as well. The complaint record, this is one that it's the most, again, it's especially for firms that get complaints for foreign objects, like was this manufacturer that they're just doing like trail mixes. They have a lot of types of nuts and tree nuts, and they do get a lot of complaints for foreign objects for like nut shells. So this, we have to check it, like all of them, also the quality ones, not only the foodborne illnesses or the foreign objects. We have to check all the complaints. The recall policy and mock recalls, especially for firms that don't get recalls, they should conduct the mock recalls just to be, to have the exercise, pest control records, training and certificates, sanitation and chemical records. So basically this is, the chemicals, they should be stored separate and under lock and should have a minimal access to them. Receiving procedures, this is big, especially for, because I had a couple of places that would, for example, the flour that comes in those huge, like the type of where like the oil is transported, they have the same kind of transportation, and they come with a seal. So I want to be there and observe receiving. and everything they do, how they break the seal, how they pump the flour in. And some of the places didn't even know. They receive usually a little bag with flour that they should keep it as their retained sample for the particular lot. I had this firm, and they just store that flour everywhere, or sometimes they just used it. So this is another thing when you have to educate them and explain to them that they should retain that sample, that's why the firm, the supplier, sends it to them just in case there is a recall, or somebody complains the flour is adulterated. You actually have the original sample. Environmental monitoring, this is huge as well. And some firms do it more often than not. Some do the testing in-house, and they have a little lab that they check, and then they have to send it for an independent lab and see, if they hit any positives. And then they should have a procedure of what are they doing in case something comes back positive, if they, they intensify the sanitation, and then they have to test how many times to get negatives. Usually they have to get 3 negatives before they can resume production in the specific area, but it's not very black and white. Some firms do it, with 3 negatives, and some just with 1. And then you have to also keep in mind that the more swabbing you do for environmental testing, the more positives you can hit. I had this firm, and they are doing swabbing twice a month, so they would have more positive hits than somebody who just swabs quarterly, or twice a year or something like that. Then the Allergen Program, I check their procedures, and I check to see how they actually are handling allergens. Sampling, some firms do samplings of the finished product. They test them for various things, also quality related. And then the newer thing is the intentional adulteration, which we don't have to check anything. We just have to mention, we just have to determine if they are subject to intentional adulteration rule or not. But so far that doesn't have to be checked. And what I forgot to put here, I'm not sure if it's in my next slide. No. So what it's missing here is the 2 lot numbers that we have to check from the beginning, from the receiving all the way to shipping. So these are the documents that I review, and believe it or not, it takes a couple of days at least, especially if they're not perfect.
Thank you, Monica. Just a couple of quick follow-up questions related to the records or documents that you're looking for. Now, regardless of the firm, whether they produce an RTE product, are you still doing an environmental monitoring procedure even if they're not producing a ready-to-eat food product?
Yes. We still have to, I remember I just had an inspection, I think it was in November. It's this manufacturer, they just are mixing flour and only dry, they do cake mixes and donut mixes, and they're not doing any environmental monitoring procedures because it's not a ready-to-eat product, because it's supposed to be processed by their customers, so they're just mixing. But you have to ask, you have to check, and you have to discuss it in the report. So they're not. So if they're not doing it, it has to. You still have to bring it up. And trust me, if that's what you forget to do, FDA will jump on you. That's what I forgot in my first my first assignment, and I had to just modify my record, my report to mention that. So now I work off of this list. I never strayed from it.
Sure.
Better safe than sorry.
Yeah, it's a lot to review, and just to kind of summarize that. So regardless of the status of whether they're producing an RTE product or not, you're still looking to see if those records exist, and if they don't, you just need to document that they don't.
Yeah, and why?
Okay. All right.
Because
and then kind of
sorry, you also want to make sure that the firm knows and they know why they don't do it, I mean, usually the top management does know it, but like the others don't really. So you trust me, just write it down a line about it and you're fine. But yeah.
Amanda, does that clarify kind of the question? The question was just a confirmation that in an inspection, the inspector must ask for the environmental monitoring program, but the processor can simply say no and justify why they don't have one. Is that kind of a good summary of what you're saying, Monica?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, right. And then kind of related to that, so with environmental monitoring, particularly for ready-to-eat food products, what's a reasonable minimal sampling regime? And how do you kind of determine that? So if someone's sampling once per 6 months versus multiple times per month, how do you determine what is the reasonable sampling regime?
I actually just mentioned it in the report, and honestly, for one of my inspections, that the one place that monitors it like twice a month, and they did have some positives. I observed all their corrective action, all their documents and records, and I mentioned everything in the report, and FDA was fine with that because I was thinking that they might come back and say, why do they get so many positives? It was also like in zone 4, it's not really next to product. It was more, from shoes or something, whatever. It wasn't somewhere that, they needed to worry. But there's no, in the regulation, it doesn't say, oh, you have to do it 3 times a year if you're over $50 million or something like that. So basically, you just talk about it, If they don't do it at all and they're supposed to do it, then you cite them for that. But otherwise, you just mention it in the discussions how they do it and what were the results for the last. They want you to check records for an entire year prior to the inspection. So you have to check the last 12 months. So, like with this firm, it took me the whole morning just to review that. It was a task, because they're monitoring so much and so often.
And related to that, are you looking or requesting for general sanitation records for the preventive controls inspections?
Yeah, because that's part of the sanitation. You have to check those.
Sure. Yeah. Now, John, related to some of this and CGMPs, I also should mention to the greater audience that we have Maine, the state of Maine, and their inspection group, Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, and then we have Monica representing Connecticut. We have 2 states doing 2 different things. We have the state of Maine, who does not have a contract with FDA to perform preventive controls. They only have a contract to do these minimal investigations related to current good manufacturing practices versus Connecticut, who has a contract. So Monica's representing essentially Connecticut and doing those FDA inspections. Maine just is doing, for example, the produce safety inspection. So we have 2 states doing 2 different things, just as a reminder. So John, when it comes to the aspects of GMPs and prerequisite programs and things like that, are you seeing any confusion around or any update, confusion around the updates that have occurred, or are people operating, from 10 years ago and they're totally unaware?
Both, yeah. And, as I stated earlier, depending on the firm, if it's a large firm, they are typically up to speed. And, some that may be driven by third-party audits that they are under also. And those happen more frequently than either my inspection or an FDA inspection. So they may very well be aware of these things. The smaller the operation, they're not aware. They're not aware of being up to speed. And literally, I've got small businesses where it's been in operation for 75 or 100 years, and they're doing things the same way. Stone ground mustard, the same way they did it 100 years ago, and really reluctant to change. And that's difficult. It's like inspecting a museum. So I don't know if that answers it.
No, that was great. I mean, I think that adaptation is difficult. We only have a few minutes left here, and I just see there's a couple more questions here and some comments. I'm just trying to summarize that so you could probably answer those in 2 minutes. So do you both have some recommendations on how you can possibly get the word out about some of the updates related to preventive controls and making sure that processors are aware of this information, or even maybe any campaigns that you and your organization has worked on so that they are more up to date?
I think this is one of the biggest challenges that I've seen, because again, going back to large and small firms, large firms have a compliance officer usually. They're just, I think, online all the time on FDA website, on whatever, USDA, just checking what the updates are, what new requirements, are in place and things like that. But small firms, like the one that my colleague encountered that did not have a food safety plan, they didn't even know what we were talking about. They had no clue. They've never been on the FDA website. And honestly, it's not even easy to navigate the FDA.gov or .org or whatever that is, because it's not only about food. They do drugs. They do everything else, medical trials, this, that. It's not easy. Even when I recommend firms to sign up for recall alerts, you don't get recalls only about the product you're manufacturing. You get all the recalls on the planet that, are non-pertaining to your particular product, or, it can be from any medication or anything that is recalled. That's the kind of alerts you get. So I think that FDA should come with a better way of informing the firms and take into consideration the smaller ones, because we don't have in the state of Connecticut, 5 inspectors for the entire state. We don't have the manpower to email everybody and say, hey, intentional adulteration, you're subject to it starting January 1st. Is your plan in order? We don't have. So I think the communication is the main factor. At least this is my personal opinion.
Sure. So that makes sense. John?
Yeah, no, I agree. In my work, in my territory, I probably have 1,000 licenses. Many of those are retail. Many of them are small home, sort of a cottage home food processor that doesn't fall in that category. But we do have a large number of processors that we deal with. And it's not uncommon for people to be absolutely unaware. Tunnel vision, I think Monica mentioned earlier. A lot of these people have tunnel vision on their operation, their process, and it doesn't go outside that realm. And it's a matter of penetrating that to get that education to them. And I don't know, as we have a program at this point to do that. Hopefully we will in the near future.
Thank you, John. Thanks, Monica. So I'm going to wrap things up. There was another quick question around kind of echoing the fact that we need to figure out a way to simplify the process for the small processors. And so just a quick moment to comment on that if either you have any suggestions on how to simplify that process so that the small processors can navigate some of these updates, or even if they're getting into the food processing area, what can they do to try to help navigate that? And I would put a plug for almost any extension program out there that be a good point of contact. But if our investigators or inspectors have any suggestions, I'm happy to hear those.
Well, yes, on my email, I have Jason Bolton's contact information. So everybody that I communicate with knows about the extension service, and we reiterate that continuously, that there is education available and that they should pursue it. It doesn't always work, but we feed that out there.
Yeah, I agree with John. We have the Department of Consumer Protection, the Food and Standards Division. You have a lot of information online, and I feel it's kind of easy to navigate once you get to that page. But some people are not computer savvy. That's another thing that I encounter a lot, especially with smaller firms that have been in business forever. And for them, it's very difficult. I like this new approach of FDA, educate before you regulate, because we talk a lot to the firms and we're trying to, educate them, steer them in the right direction. Like John said, especially about the attestation, they're like, what are you talking about? What is that even? As I said, once I'm open to communication if firms reach out, but the problem is that I cannot reach out to everybody, or our department is not able to do it. We try to keep our website as updated as possible, as user-friendly as possible. But the problem comes when people really don't want to use a computer, or they don't know how to do it, or they don't have the manpower to check those things. And that's unfortunate, but it's we're trying to reach out as much as possible, but sometimes it's really difficult.
Sure, absolutely. Well, especially when you talk about some of these small processors that are out in the middle of nowhere, even in Connecticut or Maine or wherever it may be, just trying to reach them. So anyway, so we're Jason, a little over time here. Yeah, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say on what could possibly be a lighter note, I just got a complaint about a processor who was having trouble keeping a temperature in their walk-in, and an inspector went in and found that they were putting gel packs on top of the probe for their data logger so that they could maintain a good temperature.
It's a creative solution. Well, not really a solution, but a lot of creativity there, I guess.
Yeah, we had somebody that kept hitting positive for listeria. This was years ago. And then the way he was swabbing, he was pouring a gallon of chlorine on the floor, and then he was doing the swabbing fast, just so nothing would be there, Yeah, all sorts of stories. There was a quick...
Go ahead,
yeah,
Monica.
there was a question about the validation. So if there are was this processor and he's pasteurizing nuts. The validation, I include that in the calibration record. So when I do calibration records checking, I check also the validation process. So that's where I include it, and I don't forget to ask about that.
Thanks for catching that question. Well, thank you, Monica and John, for your time today and your sharing your experiences with the panel or the group here. We really appreciate it. And thank you everyone else for joining us. And I think, Annie, you're sharing some contact information for us and so forth. So feel free to, reach out to me, and I don't want to say anything from Monica and John, but I know they're both very easy to speak with. So if you have any other questions, feel free to contact us. Have a good rest of the day, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. And again, thank you, Monica and John.